All right. Um, and then just to give a little bit of introduction, I'm Eric Stazak. I'm Executive Vice President here at Westward 360. Historically, over the last 7 years or so, I've been in charge of and leading our association management operations. Recently, that has been turned over to Kimberly Sutherland, who has helped organize and prepare for our session here with Todd from Reserve Advisors as well. So Kimberly, if you might want to just quickly introduce yourself, and then we can get over to Todd as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Kimberly Sutherland. As Eric alluded, I am the Senior Vice President with Westward 360, and I am overseeing the Community Association Management Operations team. And so you'll see my name here and there. I'm excited to invite Todd Walter to join us this evening to talk about the important document that is the reserve study. There's many opportunities to use the reserve study as you, as a board member, are managing your community, and we're here to help educate you on that, as well as help explain why it's important from our perspective as your management team. So Todd, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kimberly. It was very nice. And good evening, everyone. Really appreciate you joining us here tonight. Looking forward to the discussion. And what I think is going to be great about this discussion here tonight is it's not just going to be me talking. We've got 5 very talented and experienced managers who are going to provide their real world insight into some of these topics here today. My real quick background is that I started conducting reserve studies at Reserve Advisors in 1999. And to this day, I still very much enjoy visiting a property like yours each week. I'm proud to have been a part of Reserve Advisors from our beginning with about 8 people when I started to now approaching 90. And this topic that we're going to talk about here today, reserve studies, reserves, capital planning, it's always been an important topic. But I think there's a renewed focus on this topic. And if I were to ask the group, what possibly happened over the past few years to renew the focus on this topic, these topics, I will guarantee that the first thing you say is Surfside, the tower that collapsed in Florida. And certainly you're right. That certainly played a major role in renewing the focus on this topic. But there's more to it. We now have lending institutions and insurance companies now taking a look at our reserve studies to evaluate risk. That was happening far less prior to the past few years. More and more states around the country now requiring reserve studies. New Jersey just last year, Tennessee a couple years prior. Illinois came within inches of passing legislation earlier this year. The legislation passed the House overwhelmingly, was all set, just about to be teed up for a vote in the Senate, and then they adjourned. From what I understand, there's a decent case for this legislation to be picked back up in November in a veto session. So this Legislative Action Committee still feels that this is a good possibility. Don't ask me what a veto session is. I have no idea, but the Legislative Action Committee thinks that's when we might be a goal for this legislation. So in short, people take these conversations way more seriously nowadays. And these discussions, how are you going to pay for these big ticket projects? They're tough discussions, and every community goes through them. Best done over cocktails, because they can be really long and really challenging. And so just thinking in your heads, you have a big ticket project coming up. Could be facade work, roofing, big ticket items. How are you going to fund those projects? What are your funding mechanisms? And they are, of course, reserves, loans, or special assessments, or a combination of the 3. And I suppose you could throw weight for hail damage in there as well. About once every 5 years, somebody calls us up and they say, hey, we want you to take the roofs out of your reserve study because we're going to wait for hail damage. And they're serious. But of course, we can't do that. And there's lots and lots of theories out there as to what the best way of paying for these projects is. One of those theories is by setting aside appropriate annual reserves, you ensure that each owner pays for their fair share or their use of the association maintained components you choose to live there. That key word being the use. About a few months ago, I had a board member say to me, he was using this analogy to explain to his board this concept, and he said it'd be like putting a change box next to the elevators, and you got to put money in that box to use the elevator. So when the time comes for new elevator controls, the money's there. I'm going to steal that from him. I kind of like that. But the problem here is you have people on all sides of this argument. You have people who say, you know what, I'm not going to live here when we need new roof or major masonry work. Board needs money. I'll be the first guy to write you a check, but I can manage my money than the board can. I'm not giving you my money until you need it. So it's quite a challenge at communities to fight your way through this, because you have people on all sides of that argument. When you rely on special assessment, you rely on a loan, you've deferred that cost burden to the owners are there at that point in time. But in reality, when I first started, an old guy in Florida said to me, he said, you know, I'll be dead 5 years from now. We need new roofs. That's my kid's problem to figure out. And I get it. I understand where he's coming from. I understand it. In reality, many of your communities setting aside reserve contributions, it may or may not be entirely feasible at the moment. And that's really where I'd actually like to hear from. We have Chris, a very experienced, very talented manager who can provide some insight on these discussions, because he's been through these discussions a ton of times. Chris, you want to kind of weigh in on how some of those discussions go?
Sure thing, Todd. Yeah. So, I mean, I've certainly experienced a time or two the boards discussing how they're going to take on some of these larger expenditures. A lot of times special assessments and loans get brought up, and a lot of times there have been many boards who have been pretty fervently against the loans or special assessments, feeling like they may be more of a four-letter word. But the thing is, they don't really have to be a four-letter word. If they're used properly, along with their standard budgetary confinements, they can actually be a really great tool that the association can use, and may be just what the community needs to turn things around. So, I've experienced several that have successfully implemented the combination of, and we're better off for it. So, it's really just a matter of, what per se the needs of the association are, what the owners are capable of, and just coming up with a comprehensive plan to address everything. Oftentimes, you can even bring in your accountant and or some of the bank's. The bank's lending agents would be gladly attend board meetings to help walk through the loan process. So there's a lot of tools to the board's disposal to help walk through a loan and or special assessment.
Yeah, well said. Very, very good insight, Chris. Very much appreciate that. Before I move on, I saw a little note. Do I need to make an adjustment to my settings?
Yeah, there's like a small little like picture-in-picture effect going on. If you maybe can even just move that down to the corner a bit, if it won't minimize.
Uh-oh.
I was wondering what clicking the X would do.
That's what I just did, and it took me out of this. Is that a little better now it's on the corner?
Yeah, it's not blocking text. Is that okay for folks, attendees? Okay, yeah, I think that's good for now.
Perfect. Sorry about that. Thank you. Thank you for the heads up. I really appreciate it. So, but guess what happens come budgeting season? What's that first item that gets cut or not increased? That reserve contribution. Especially during the pandemic. Difficult financial times for all of us. We wanted to give our owners a break financially. I get it. I understand that. The issue is that now there's a lot of communities in Chicago who are in a tough spot because they did not put away these reserve contributions. Now they have to take on the project, and they don't have the money to take on to do it. So it's a tough situation. And I'm going to take one more real quick. Give me 1 second here, because I see now the settings got messed up again a little bit. So give me 1 second here. Last technical difficulty of the day, I guarantee it here. So now you guys should be able to see a new slide said how much to set aside, correct?
All good.
Perfect. Thank you for bearing with me there. So again, now the question becomes, how much do you set aside? There is a tendency around the country, certain entities, certain states, to tie in some way, shape, or form a percent of the operating budget to a balance or a contribution, a reserve balance or reserve contribution. Illinois simply states reasonable with no definition of reasonable. But guess what happens in places like Michigan, where you have this 10% requirement? People put away 10%, they think they're doing just fine. of the 34,000 studies we've done, I'm not so sure there's one case where 10% is sufficient. And when you step back and think about it, what does the size of your operating budget have to do with the cost to replace your roofs or restore your masonry? And the answer is nothing. So just that whole concept of a percent of the operating budget is did a real disservice. And what the Legislative Action Committee in Michigan was trying to do when they implemented this was they wanted a floor, a bare minimum. Their intention was not to say that 10% you're doing just fine. Their idea was 10% is better than zero. But there's just simply far too many variables that go in determining how much to set aside to have that one size fits all percentage. So a couple points on this analysis here. That blue line represents your reserve balances over time. The red bars represent your reserve expenditures over time. The red bars can get pretty big, pretty scary. Oh, you know what? And I greatly apologize. This slide was a good spot for, we have another very experienced, very talented manager here, Marcia, who has a little bit of insight on this slide. And I apologize, Marcia, for not prompting you appropriately here, as I know you have some good thought here.
That's okay. No, I was just going to give you an example. This year I had a condo association and they had only budgeted 9% for the reserves. And they had an owner that lost 3 sales because they didn't even have the 10% threshold. You're currently working on a reserve study for them as we speak, which is great because 10% won't be enough either. But one owner did lose a sale to 3 different mortgage companies just because they didn't have the 10%. So that really is a definite minimum baseline.
Yeah, good insight, Marcia. Very good. Thank you. Appreciate that. So this analysis, that blue line, the reserve balances over time. My point being here, a couple points here actually. One of the biggest mistakes we see associations make is they'll eyeball a reserve balance. They'll say, "Hey, we've got $1 million in the bank. Aren't we doing well?" Well, knowing a reserve balance without knowing where you're at with your expenditures is completely meaningless. Year before your big ticket projects better be a pretty big balance. Year after your big ticket projects, get away with a lot less. And yet from attorneys to accountants to board members to managers, I apologize if any of you guys are realtors on this call, but realtors seem to be the worst. How can everybody eyeball that reserve balance and give an opinion if it's good or bad, but I can't? And until you actually lay out your expenditures, you have no idea if that balance is good or bad. Another little mistake we see people make is targeting the same reserve balance each year regardless of where they're at with their expenditures. They'll say, "Hey, we want to have 500,000 in the bank at all times." Now, if you targeted a number that's at one of those peaks, one of the high points, that blue line, you're probably okay. But no one does that. They target a balance that's below those peaks, and it gets a lot of communities in a lot of trouble. An appropriate balance is going to vary based on where you're at with your expenditures. Another little side note for those of you, especially in townhome type communities, one of the first things we see associations do, the first go-to when they have to take on a project, they don't have the money, first thing that board president says is, "We'll phase the project. We'll do it over an extended period of time." Now, if you phase a project past a low point in that blue line, yeah, that helps. But sometimes you're phasing a project and you're not even helping. You're actually costing yourself because you're phasing a project prior to the low point in that blue line. So you're paying for mobilization over and over again. You're cheating that contractor about he can't give you the best unit cost for that work because you got spread out over so many years. I had a large high-rise in Chicago. Their issue was masonry, large development. They phased the project over so many years that now they have to go back to some of the initial phases because they're having leaks on those elevations before they're even done with the project. Phasing, spreading the project out, is not always the answer. And yet it seems to be the first go-to for a lot of communities who have to take on a project and they don't have the money. Reserve study is the tool that determines the appropriate annual reserve contributions. But more importantly, reserve study simply allows you to make an informed decision. If somebody thinks reserves are the way to go, the study will highlight those contributions. If somebody who thinks special assessments are the better way to go, or loans, can use those funding mechanisms too. Believe it or not, we don't care how you guys pay for these projects. We just want to help you make an informed decision come budgeting season. You're in budgeting season now, you're plugging in that reserve contribution. We want to give you some backing make an informed decision as to a number to plug in there. Some of our best clients, in fact, one in particular, been updating with us every 3 years since 1991. They special assess for everything. The funding plan goes in the garbage. They don't use it. But what's interesting about that, and that's fine with us, doesn't matter to us how you guys pay for these projects. Again, you can put away zero, doesn't matter to us. What's interesting about that community, though, and it's a very wealthy community where we know everybody's last names, they had some new blood move in, and the new blood said, so basically they special assess every year. So every year there's a special assessment for the capital projects. New blood moves in and says, you know what? I don't even know where the freight elevator is yet, and I'm getting hit with a special assessment. This isn't right. And so even in that community, you have the old school special assess for everything now going up against the new blood, the new school, saying we should be reserving more, not special assessing everybody. And it's quite an interesting tug of war at the moment here. Because what's one of the biggest reasons we see associations not conduct reserve studies? It's because they're afraid of the results. But again, back to that last slide, we just want to help you make an informed decision. Doesn't matter to us how you pay for these projects. Is that roof going to last longer or cost less if you don't know it's coming? Of course not. When I get to ask somebody who's never had a reserve study, come budget season, you're plugging in that reserve contribution line, how are you determining what it should be, what to put away? And we get some wild answers. But thankfully, a lot of people say, hey, we're just guessing, or we're putting in the bare minimum, or we're putting in what's left. But again, the point here to help you make an informed decision. Simply put, we want to put together a program, a financial game plan that keeps that line, this purplish color, whatever color that is in this slide, above a minimum threshold as you age. Take on your projects in a timely manner and keep the association in a good financial spot. You'll hear words like structural integrity as a key buzzword. The idea is to maintain a financial game plan that takes on these projects in a timely manner. I heard this saying the other day that said financial integrity leads to structural integrity. And I like that saying, meaning you have the money to do a project with scope of work that doesn't cut corners, does a project in a timely manner, you can maintain your structural integrity. Independent, you'll see the word independent on here a couple times. Independent opinions can back up the board's decisions. It's not just the board being mean, raising dues. It's this independent professional that's saying, hey, this thing is in bad shape. It's going to cost a lot of money, and you should figure out how to pay for it here in the near term. A quick story here. When I first, long ago, this was like 1999, 2000, probably the worst board meeting I've ever been to, easily. A fairly low income community. They had roofing systems that were in bad shape. They had a siding that I hope none of you guys even know what it is, called T111, because I hope it's all gone. Bad shape, no money. So they had to special assess everybody, and it was a painful special assessment to take on these projects. And they needed me to come in and be this independent professional expert saying that this stuff is in bad shape, like back up their decision. And I pulled into the parking lot, into the complex, and they had a clubhouse in the middle, townhomes were on the outside, and there was a line waiting to get into the clubhouse. And I knew I was in trouble. And then I got into the clubhouse, I skipped in front of the line, got in the clubhouse, and it's the only board meeting I've ever been at where they hired security guards. And there was a security guard on each end of the table. And I felt horrible for this board, because this board was just trying to fix the wrongs that were done by the previous boards who weren't maintaining those components, in addition to not setting aside reserves. And so this board was stuck with having to deal with that problem. And I felt absolutely horrible for them. So this is kind of a new slide for me, snuck in here. About 3-4 months ago, I received a call from a Chicago manager, frantic Chicago manager, saying, hey, a mortgage just got denied because of your reserve study. And that picture you see on the right, that was the picture. So that's an elevated garage floor with a little bit of water getting through. Not a big deal. In this particular case, we had to write the mortgage lender that, hey, this is not a big deal. This is on their radar screen. They're budgeting for repairs down the road. Doesn't even need to be repaired right now. And it went through. And we also, a little bit after that, received a call, another mortgage that got denied. This was out east, because we labeled the roofs in fair condition. I thought, man, we label a lot of roofs in poor condition. Like, how are those getting through? So I don't know what's going on here, but my thought is that there are people looking at our reserve studies who don't know what they're looking at. And this is going to be an interesting situation to watch. And actually, we have a manager, Kimberly, a very experienced manager who has some good insight on this topic as well. And I appreciate hearing what she has to say as well, because I need to learn about this too.
Yeah, so I'm just wanted to say that I'm finding also with lenders getting a lot of questions that somebody, even unbeknownst to us as the management team, put us on a deferred maintenance list that they can't get funding, and all it says to them is that we're on some deferred maintenance list. And so without any detail, I can't even figure out how to get a community off of that list. And so it's very crucial that we are staying up on top of what has to get done, because the lenders don't even necessarily know how to help us help the community get them off of that list. So when we're providing these, reserve studies as part of the closing documents, we see people, either it's the realtors that are looking at it, or sometimes it's even just the lending professional, and they're not paying attention to something, and they check some sort of box and something gets reported, and now we can't help a owner close on their unit.
Man, that's a tough spot, but very good insight, Kimberly. I really appreciate that. It's interesting to see where this goes. I mean, a year from now, it'd be interesting to see an update on this topic. So this is where we're going to take a little bit of a detour. Is in light of that tower that collapsed in Florida and some of what happened, some of the stories along that. So first of all, reserve state providers, we're in a unique position because we see a ton of properties each year. Reserve advisors, we see now it's over 3,500. I have 3,000 on my screen here, but you can think of this concept as we are in a unique spot to identify conditions that are abnormal, conditions that warrant bringing in a specialist for that component. You can think of that as your reserve state provider being your primary care physician and being in a good position to recommend when it's time to bring in a specialist. If we see abnormal cracking, abnormal settlement, something out of the ordinary where it's time to bring in a specialist, that can be a benefit to the association in maintaining their structural integrity here. And in my entire career, 1999, I've only had one case where I had to report to the proper authorities, a garage structure actually in the city of Chicago that I thought was in severe danger of a major structural failure. But I heard on a national CAI webinar, a reserve state provider say, a national reserve state provider say, if your reserve study is not pretty, simply defer some projects until the funding gets better. And I couldn't believe I heard that. Do you know how easy my job would be if that was the case? Everybody would love us. But unfortunately, we have to be the bearer of bad news sometimes. Sometimes there are associations that their finances, their projects, their conditions, their finances, they're in some deep trouble that deferring projects isn't going to get them out of. In addition, there's a lot of projects we can't defer. So unfortunately, we have to be the bearer of bad news sometimes. And it's often good to bring us out. If you're a community that's struggling with some of that, let us come out and talk to your community and talk to them about the conditions, the challenges that you face. Let us be that sort of, we can be, we're going to have a target on our back. We can be that target, or at least the first line of defense sometimes. So these conditions are bad, right? Like these conditions should have been fixed a long time ago. We may never know why that tower collapsed in Florida. We may never know the reason, but there was this board paralysis that we see all the time. And that board paralysis is where the board, they know they have a problem that they have to fix. They often know the costs or what they need to do to fix it, but they don't have the money in reserves. They don't want special assess. They don't want to take out a loan, or the board members argue with each other as to which way they want to pay for these projects. So they do nothing year after year after year, and the conditions become critical. That paralysis was evident at Surfside. These particular pictures, this is a city of Chicago elevated garage floor. When this association first found out the first dollar, the cost to repair all of this was about $1 million. By the time they got around to it, it was $3 million because they didn't have the money. They didn't want a special assessed, didn't want to take a loan, so they did nothing. And each year that went by, the conditions got worse and worse. Again, that paralysis we see all the time. I know the picture on the left is a little goofy with that shading, but that's a garage structure outside of Cleveland that actually did collapse. Same concept, board paralysis. Board knew they had a problem, didn't have the money to fix it, so they did nothing for too long. Thankfully, no one was hurt. The picture on the right, that perimeter wall, I don't know if you can quite tell in the picture, but it's leaning a lot. And the story there, that wall actually did collapse onto that sidewalk. Now, thankfully, no one was hurt. But the story there is that there was an engineer on the board who said, you know what, that wall has been leaning for a long time. It's not going anywhere. Now, underlying his comments, in my opinion, is that this association, they have miles and miles of this wall. They didn't have the money to fix the wall. So I think he was sort of making that comment in the context of they don't have the money to do anything about it unless they special assess or take out a loan. And so what happened in Florida after the tower that collapsed? First of all, they initially required you to be a licensed professional engineer in the state of Florida. They quickly learned that there weren't a whole lot of professional engineers who want to do reserve studies. So they opened it up to reserve specialists. But my point here mainly is to the debate in Florida wasn't whether to have a reserve study done. The debate was whether to require associations to fund their contributions per a reserve study. And their compromise, or what they thought was a compromise, was that each reserve study in Florida is going to be broken up in 2 buckets. And this is 3 stories and above is the requirement. 2 buckets. One bucket is what they call structural. And I list there in red what they call structural, what they label as structural. The other bucket is everything else. Associations in Florida have to fund their reserve contributions per reserve study for the structural bucket. They can waive funding for the non-structural bucket. One issue here, the non-structural bucket includes some important stuff like elevators. And guess what everybody's doing? They're taking their entire pot of money, their entire reserve balance, and putting it all towards structural because they have to fund structural. No money towards the non-structural. And in addition, a lot of communities in Florida, they can't even come close to funding the structural bucket. So it's quite a mess at the moment in Florida because of that, what they thought was a compromise. Just a quick side note here, that we're engineers, not lawyers. We rely on a representative of the association, if that's management, if that's the board, to inform us who maintains what. Hopefully that's based off a legal responsibility matrix from your legal counsel. But how you answer some of those questions, like if the windows are association responsibility versus owner, that's kind of a night and day reserve study, which way that goes. So I just thought I'd throw that in here as a quick note that to stay on top of your legal responsibilities, make sure you know legally who's responsible for what, windows being a big one there. A lot of components there's no reserve study provider is going to miss. Of course, you're going to get roofing, major mechanicals. Little side note here, see a lot of my pictures are mainly tailored towards high rises. I personally only inspect high rises, but engineers special. We have engineers specialize in all different types of properties. But these concepts apply to everybody, even if you're a townhome. But what about the not so obvious stuff? Piping. That can be quite challenging, especially you live in a townhome type community and that subsurface utility piping that you can't see is an association maintained. Maybe it's the stormwater, maybe it's the domestic water, the sanitary waste. How are you going to account for that if you're an aging community? If you're brand new, probably don't need to deal with it. Built in the 70s, 60s, even some in the 80s, need to have some kind of allowances in there for that stuff. You can't see that piping. Galvanized steel domestic water risers in the city of Chicago. So the hot side, the domestic hot water risers, a major problem. The worst project you can go through. I bet some of the managers on this call would probably agree with me that you're busting open people's walls. Not just really costly, but really intrusive. So you need to make sure that you're accounting for some of those components that you can't see at times. It's our opinion that these reserve studies should be independent. They should give you a completely independent opinion, completely independent backing of the useful lives and the costs. So not in it to write the specs for projects, not in it to do the project management. That reserve study provider should have no reason to increase the cost, no reason to move a project up. Our opinion is that reserve study providers should only make their money conducting reserve studies so they can give you that independent opinion and back up your decisions. And this is really a good spot. As I know that Donna, another experienced, talented manager out there, Donna has some good insight on how this can be beneficial to your board as well. Donna, do you mind with your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Years ago, back in 2016, 2015, 2016, I had an association that they thought they had their funds figured out for roofs, asphalt, improvements. And then COVID hit and prices increased quite a bit. We had a reserve study done. And when we had the reserve study done, we realized that what we were budgeting for these items was not enough. And the board had to basically double the assessment in order to set aside enough money for the reserves to be able to pay for these capital improvements. So having this reserve study and having that objective opinion of what the assessments should be, and what we should be funding to the reserve study was really, really helpful. So that's what I wanted to bring up.
Oh, great insight, Donna. Very good. Very nice. If we could predict exactly when these expenditures are going to occur, we'd be in the stock market and not conducting reserve studies. Of course, we can't get the exact expenditure in the exact year. No board member, no manager, no engineer, no one can do that. That's not the point of this study. The point is to identify reasonable expenditures for purposes of calculating a reasonable reserve contribution. A quick side note here on this. There's an executive at a very large national management company, and in one of his major markets, we're the only preferred reserve study provider for their market. So we get hundreds of thousands of dollars from this reserve study, from this management company every year. And this executive said to me, he said, Todd, 90% of your costs are wrong. I thought to myself, boy, this guy likes us, gives us all his business. Like, what does somebody who doesn't like us have to say? But this executive knew that it's not about right and wrong. This executive knew that if his associations did three things: kept up with their preventative maintenance, got their reserve studies updated in a timely manner, and most importantly, put away the reserve contributions, they were going to do quite well. Makes his boards look good, makes his managers look good, makes his management company look good. So again, this isn't about right and wrong. We'll often hear from managers say, hey, you said we should replace our roofs in 2025. No, that's not what we're saying. We're saying, hey, based on our experience, condition versus the age of those roofs, we think you should be thinking about this project. This project should be in a radar screen, probably in the ballpark of 2025. Of course, the expenditures are not you hear the word like the gospel. Of course, they can move around. Sometimes you're lucky, you can move project back. Sometimes you're unlucky, you got to move it up. As long as you're putting away those reserve contributions, that's the key. That's the key. Also, we could argue all day some of the times of these expenditures, like how bad your carpet in your hallways needs to be to require replacement. Probably all have a different opinion of that. But it doesn't last forever. When the time comes to replace that carpet, sizable dollar amount that should be planned for. Prioritization of projects, just a quick note here. It is easy for associations to say, well, we're going to defer the aesthetic stuff. And that's, for the most part, that's quite smart. Our prioritization of projects that if you defer the project may result in water infiltration. Let's say your roof is not in great shape. Defer the project, maybe you start leaking into units, or the costs increase. Like say your masonry is not in great shape. Defer that project, those small cracks become big cracks. The minor deterioration becomes a little bit more major and the costs go up. But there is a limit to how far you can defer some of the aesthetics. Like you still have to take into account a positive overall aesthetic impression to not just your owners, but how about prospective buyers? So when we're speaking with a board, walking them through a challenging funding situation, what can we move out? What do we really need to do? Certainly we look at some of the aesthetic projects to move out, but there is a limit. We can't move them out a crazy amount just to make sure your reserve contribution goes down. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time on this slide here and a couple stories on this slide too, actually. I guess, first of all, some of the details, we build our contributions towards a low point in your cash flow, the low point, that blue line, if you remember that graph. How low to go in your low point, that's a debatable topic. We'll give you our 2 cents worth. But one thing to keep in mind, let's say we give you an opinion of 100,000 in your low point, the lowest point in your cash flow, $100,000. People take that $100,000 and they run with it like that's appropriate for any year. Like, as long as we stay above 100,000 any year, we're good. That's not the case. That's only okay in that 1 year where you have a low point. Any other year, you'd be way off. If there is the need for a significant increase, we do our best to step or phase in those increases. If you have your low point, your cash flow is way down the road, that gives us plenty of time to step in those increases. But what if it's like right away in the next couple of years? That's not a whole lot of time for us to step or phase in those increases. So there is a limit to how many steps or phases we'll provide, because each step or phase, either for the cost burden down the road to the future owners, we can't do a whole lot of that. But when I do these reserve studies and it's a difficult financial plan, I think about, what if my grandma lived here? Like, what can I do to help? And as much as we try, sometimes there's simply some associations that they're in a tough spot, no matter how many steps or phases you can put in there. And when it comes to the financial analysis, this is really where the topics, this is really where some of the difficult conversations come in when you meet with boards afterwards, after they get their reserve study. Some of the heated topics, the heated debates, and some of the arguments that we face regularly. First of all, we'll hear, well, we can't afford this. And I think you're supposed to have more patience as you get older, but for whatever reason, as I get older, I have less patience. And I haven't said this yet, but we can't afford this. I get it. You got to look at costs, but your fiduciary responsibility is to maintain the investment of the owners. And how do you know what all 40 units at your property can and cannot afford? We'll often we're on fixed incomes. And look, I get it. I understand it. But aren't we all on fixed incomes? There was a lawyer, contentious board meeting, board members battling back and forth, like why they're, blaming each other for why they're in a bad spot financially. And this lawyer had it. He was done. This was about just a few months ago. This lawyer said, stop catering to those who can't afford to live here and start catering to those who can. Now, I'm not brave enough. I'm not nearly brave enough to say that, but I thought that was quite powerful. There's more to being a board member than saving people money. You have to always consider maintaining their investment. And that's where these discussions can get really, really tough and really, really personal at times. How to read a reserve study. Obviously, it can be a big document, 100 pages, lots of line items for the bigger studies. First thing I'd like to say is start with the basics. Start with the next 5 years, because those are the projects where you don't have a whole lot of time to figure out what you're going to do funding wise for those projects. Do you feel that the project, you like where it's at? Do you think you move it out? Do you need to move it up? Boil that entire reserve study down into the next 5 years is my recommendation. So come budgeting season, I'd be looking at the 5-year focus that we provide. Do we like where the projects are at? What kind of changes do we need to move? It just simply makes this a lot more digestible. And this is really where we have Elizabeth with us as well. Again, another experienced manager who has a lot of experience looking at these reserve studies and has a little bit of insight as to how to read and use these reserve studies that I think you guys will find value. Elizabeth, do you mind chiming in?
Sure. Thank you, Todd. I would say, with the reserve studies, it's definitely a good tool to be used during budget season. It's a great way to kind of look at what's forecasted in the future and make sure that you're budgeting to the best that you can. It definitely gives us that 30-year window of expenses, and it just really helps us as a tool when we're budgeting to really, make sure that we're doing everything we can to avoid some of these bigger situations, like being blacklisted and, the special assessments or the loans in the future as needed. So definitely take a look at it and make sure that you're kind of looking at things, in the near future and budget for it accordingly.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Thank you, Elizabeth. And this is just sort of an example of that 5-year outlook. Again, my recommendation for the projects within those next 5 years. And I know this doesn't really apply to Illinois because Illinois has some laws with what they disclose, but have to disclose to prospective buyers and owners. But in a lot of states that don't have those same laws, I recommend you distribute just the executive summary and the 5-year outlook, as that's really gives the people the heart of the near term picture. Again, I know that doesn't really apply to Illinois. So a quick note on updates, getting studies up to date. How often should you conduct a reserve study? Illinois at the moment does not require updates. If that legislation that's pending that I mentioned, it's 5 years. It'd be every 5 years. And that's sort of a common number nowadays. But my point here being that older, more complex communities probably need to get their studies more often than newer or less complex communities. If you are a high-rise, a complex high-rise, lots of major mechanicals, and you're older, built in the 70s or older, probably need to take a fresh look at your components and get that study up to date more often. And one of the things we want to see here is the rate of deterioration. Is something aging better than we thought? If it's aging better than we thought, let's move it out. What if it's aging worse than we thought? Might have to move it up. So we want to be able to see that rate of deterioration each time we come out to a property. Now this graph I know says Florida plus. This is the most boring graphic I've ever seen. But to us, this was pretty exciting. We went back to 1991 when we started. We plotted, I'm going to show you Illinois here in a moment, all of our clients in Florida. I'm showing you Florida because the concepts of reserves and reserve studies, they've been around for quite a long time. And it's about that 3-year mark where people update their studies in Florida. Let's go to Illinois, about the 4-year mark. And we were really pleased with that because somebody long ago, somebody in the 80s or 90s, very influential, made the comment in Chicago that you get your reserve studies updated every 5 years, and it's stuck. And we still have a lot of old school managers in Chicago. Some of you may be on this call who it's 5 years, regardless of property, new, complex, old, doesn't matter. You get your reserve studies updated every 5 years. Again, there is not a one size fits all update interval. And some of this might be projects. Maybe you just finished a bunch of major projects. You want to reset your reserve study to account for that. Or maybe you're trying to plan for some major projects with a loan or a special assessment, and you want to see how that all looks together in an updated reserve study. So each community is going to be a little bit different. Again, that 2 to 5 years, probably the window, and it was great to see this here in Illinois. As Kimberly mentioned, we'll stay on to answer questions. Just bear with me for just a little bit more here. I don't have a whole lot of slides left. CAI changed their standards to now require reserve studies to include preventative maintenance that maximizes useful life of the components. They kind of recognize that a properly executed reserve study, proper preventative maintenance, put those two together, and you have this financial integrity that we're looking for here. Most reserve study providers, the big ones in Chicago, this really didn't change. I actually saw that, so I see that question pop up from Martin. And yes, I did say that the legislation in Illinois would be 5 years, max up to 5 years. So you can obviously update prior to that for those high rises, but at the moment, the way it's written, it would be 5 years would be the state requirement. Good question. So the concept here with this preventative maintenance within reserve studies, and as I mentioned, kind of business as usual for most of the major reserve study providers in Chicago, is to take a more proactive approach to preventative maintenance instead of reactive. When I go to some of the larger properties in Chicago, high rise, for the first time, I'll ask, what's been the history of facade repairs? And we'll often get, well, if it leaks, we fix it. In other words, their history is only chasing leaks. That never ends well. In other words, they're not getting on the building to do the small stuff before it becomes big stuff, to get to the small stuff before it leaks into units. And the idea with this was to push people more towards that proactive approach to preventative maintenance. kind of a silly little example, and I wish I would have made these numbers stand out a little bit more here. But my point being that the idea is also to maximize the life cycle, the life cycle of that component, to not reduce the useful life, to maximize the useful life of that component. Top community spent some money on preventative maintenance, but they maximized the useful life, 20 years. Lower community didn't spend the money on preventative maintenance, but now they reduced the useful life of that component. And so it did end up being an increase in the overall costs, not by much. I wish I would have give you a different example, but my point being, you don't want to reduce the useful lives of these components. That never ends well for your communities, especially things like roofing, especially things like sealant, caulking your all windows, masonry work, maximizing that useful life. A couple quick notes on choosing a reserve state provider. First and foremost, post-study support, above all, above everything else. Are they willing to come out and meet with your board, walk you through the study, walk you through their recommendations, help you through that capital planning? That's huge, especially for board members who maybe may not be on board with this, or maybe they're new to the process. Make sure you get that post-study support from your reserve state provider. Also, a quick note here, if the report is easy to read, it'll be easy to use. Most reserve state providers will provide you their tables in Excel format with formulas. So if you can read the report easily, you want to use those Excel tables, they should be easy for you to use. A couple concluding points here. We talked about the first one, use. Owners will often ask, board members will often ask me like, hey, I want to set aside reserves for these projects. I want to raise our reserve contributions, but I'm the only one. No one else wants to raise their fees, to raise their reserve contribution. What do I say? Man, I wish I had a perfect response to that. But that concept of the use has gained some traction with people. You're paying for the use of that component, not putting away money for a project you may or may not live there to see. You're paying for what you're using right now. That can be a concept that works. That second bullet, the mindset as you go into these budgeting meetings, fiduciary responsibility of the board of directors is to maintain the investment of the owners. It's not to save people money. And I'm not saying take the highest bidder or you don't consider costs, but at the end of every decision, you have to answer yes to, did I maintain the investment of the owners? Next up, finally, as condominium buyers become more and more educated, they're asking about reserves. Am I getting hit with special assessment, hit with paying more than my fair share? So being able to show communities or prospective buyers that you're not, everybody's paid their fair share, you're not getting hit with that, that can be used as a selling tool. There are some communities that we work with regularly who have done that. They've never had a special assessment, never taken a loan, put away more than what we recommend, and they use that as a selling tool. Now, the counter to that is that for some of them, their fees are higher than most. So that's why you guys get paid the big bucks as board members to kind of balance that. One little word of caution though, when talking about fees being higher than your neighbor, is it's often hard to find an apples to apples comparison when talking about reserve requirements. The components, the ages, the construction quality, the amenities, there's a lot that goes into determining how much association should have in reserves. So an apples to apples comparison is sometimes tough to find. And then finally, I hope that the experienced managers would agree with me here that communities that have reserves available to take on projects in a timely manner, in other words, take them on before the conditions become critical, take them on with a scope of work that doesn't cut corners, they're just better off. They're just better run. And so with that, I'd like to open up the floor to questions, and I can certainly stay as long as you would like to answer any of those questions. We can go back to any of the topics. I saw a couple pop up. Kimberly, if you are able to read those off.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll start with a couple in the chat, and then I have some that were submitted ahead of time. So we'll ask those. So Barbara had asked, curious if you will address this in your presentation, but she'd like you to speak to an HOA where they already have a loan, they're finishing up their capital projects and looking to re-amortize their loan for owners still paying off over time, and suggestions to put leftover funds into reserves and allocate other projects where we have quotes for other projects. what does a reserve study look like for that type of scenario?
Yeah, that's a good question here. And by all means, Kimberly, any of the other experienced managers, you guys feel free to jump in here as well. Before I get to that question, can I just a quick story here, because it just prompted my, I meant to tell this story earlier, but the worst, when it comes to loans, the worst financial situation I have ever seen, and it's actually in the city of Chicago, they took out a loan for everything, and they tried to fund the loan payments from reserves, but without raising their reserve contributions to account for the loan payments. So they're at the point now where their entire annual reserve contribution goes towards their loan payments, while at the same time, they now have roofing and masonry and air handling units, all that are in really bad shape. That's a really tough spot to be in, and the worst I have ever seen. I have no idea how they're going to get out of that. So your scenario here, and I bet I'm going to miss some of your points, but reserve studies, we do show these loan scenarios. We can show the money coming in from loan proceeds, even if you take out an additional line of credit. We can show the loan payments. We can show special assessment income coming in if you want to use that to offset. But so we would, first of all, lay out those loan payments within your reserve study. So we account for them in the reserve contribution calculations. We will then work with you on the projects that you can defer and the projects that you have to take on, in our opinion, and see if we can find a solution there using all of those sources of income: special assessment income, loan income, and reserve contributions, a mixture of those three that works so that you have a financial path out of where you're at and can still take on your financial, take on these projects in a timely manner. Kimberly, I don't know if that answered her question well, but you might have some opinion there as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I know she said she may have to leave early, but just so when an associate gets a loan, you're really basically taking in advance because you don't have the amount of money you need in reserves. So you're sort of taking in advance. So as you go to pay that back, you have to have a funding plan in order to still reserve for the future, because that's not going away. And then you also have to have the funding plan in order to, pay back the loan. And it's very possible you can pay back the loan out of regular assessments, but you have to be able to increase your assessments enough to cover that, as well as still continue to fund the reserves.
Well said. Well said.
So the next question is, Nate had a question about smaller associations, and this just might be a product offering that you can speak to, but is there a less expensive option that does maybe not include an on-site visit if it's just a smaller or newer association that doesn't have, such complex modeling in order to provide a reserve study?
Yeah, so the modeling is not, it's quite basic. It's just a running cash flow. And even though you're small, some of these communities are small. If you're a small apartment style community, you still maintain some really, really important stuff: roofing, facade, masonry. It's one of the most important things you pay for would be that engineer to come out and conduct that condition assessment. We can't put together a reserve study unless we know the condition of your components. So we'd have to come out to visit the property. And I don't want to diminish that, because that's one of the most important parts of the entire study. If you're a site condo where you maybe maintain a sign, an interest monument, a pond, let's talk. We can give you some other options to not conduct a full reserve study. But if you're a small apartment style community, you maintain some really, really important stuff where that reserve study is just as valuable as it is to a major high rise. So we personally work with Westward 360 to try to help with our fees, but there is a minimum here, because we have to be out on the property to see your conditions, because your reserve study, the accuracy of your reserve study, if you don't account for the conditions, it's really meaningless.
Good point. So Kathleen is asking more clarification about the reserve study legislation. So there is pending legislation. There's nothing in currently. I believe the next time they're going to talk about it is in November. So the anticipation is that something will pass, that it will be every 5-year requirement. So you'll have to have a reserve study, at least by the end of 2025, and then every 5 years after that. Then the second part of our question asked if there were fines associated with that. So that's sort of, we're going to wait and see, right, with what this legislation comes out with, one, what the requirement is and what then their anticipation is of, putting teeth behind it and actually making sure it's enforceable. So that's not yet known to us. So we're all waiting. So a question that was submitted before tonight, one was, what are the risks associated with preparing the study? Will the study need to be disclosed to potential buyers? And if so, wouldn't doing so decrease the value of the property?
Correct me if I'm wrong, Kimberly, per Illinois law, it does have to be disclosed to prospective buyers.
I believe that there are components that have to be included in the, if you have it, it needs to be in the closing package.
Yeah.
They are asking for that now.
And again, experienced managers jump on this here because this is not my area of expertise, but if your association shows the need for significant increases in your contributions or shows the need for special assessments or loans because you don't have the money in the near term, that's not the prettiest picture that you want to be painting to a prospective buyer, and your concern is legit.
Correct. And we're seeing that the buyers, as Marcia even touched on, that lenders do not want to extend a mortgage to somebody if they feel that there is a risk to the potential financial health of an association. Which leads me to a follow-up question. We did have a board member ask that if you have a reserve study and you're supposed to be funding according to that, right? That's the best recommendation. Illinois says reasonable. Your study is a recommendation. And if they choose not to fund to it and then something happens and they don't have the money, and now this might be a question for the attorney, not so much you, but is the board considered liable?
You certainly take on risk. We have seen in other states the boards being litigation being brought against boards for failure fulfill their fiduciary responsibility, but those were in bad cases where they were not they're basically put away nothing. So again, this reserve study is simply a guide, simply allows you to make an informed decision. Even if I'm an owner or a board member at a community and I think special assessments are the better way to go, there needs to be a good faith effort to put away something that is, I hate to use the word reasonable because that's what Illinois legislation states, but because it doesn't give much guidance, but it has to be, I guess my recommendation here, again, Kimberly, jump in, is that there needs to be some effort given to put away a reasonable reserve contribution, even if you're not able to put away the entire amount. It can't be 10%, 20% of our contributions. I certainly understand if you can't put away the whole thing.
Yeah, and generally when that happens, there is a funding plan that you recognize, we can't fund it 100%, but we're going to fund it X because we know we're going to have to do Y. Yeah. And generally you've talked about that as a board as you're making your conscious decisions each year for budgeting.
The problem, as I mentioned earlier, you got three ways to pay for these projects: reserves, loans, special assessments. The problem owners and board members are the ones who don't want to do any of it. Okay, so you won't want to put in reserve contributions. Okay, that's fine. That means you're going to be relying on special assessments or loans down the road. But you get those people who don't want to do any of those three, and that's not, they got to pick one. It can't be zero.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of funding, we did have a question. And so obviously Chris, Marcia, Donna, or Elizabeth can jump in. But someone asked, is it proactive to secure a credit card for emergency repairs? So I know how I personally feel about associations that look to have a credit card. But my opinion is that is not the best way to plan to spend money if you can even get the amount of credit that you would need for that type of repair.
I agree. Credit cards just lead to more issues because they can't pay they can't make the credit card payment then. So
yes, Would
From-
completely agree with that. I would mirror that opinion that the credit card would not be a good solution specific to a capital expenditure. Might be good for some of the smaller purchases and payoff as the balance is due, but I do not think that that would be a good route for a larger capital expenditure.
Thank you. One more question. Is an annual capital improvements budget required or preferred based upon capital projects indicated in the reserve study?
Well, an annual capital budget is recommended. I would, again, Kimberly, feel to jump in, is recommended. Now, does it exactly match what's in the reserve study? May or may not, but certainly most communities will have to take on some capital projects each year, or at least should be thinking or have on the radar screen the potential for some capital projects.
Yeah, absolutely. There is obviously the reserve studies are a recommendation, and if you feel that maybe you do roof maintenance every year, right? You say our roof have a certain life expectancy. We do a maintenance plan every year to hopefully prolong the life of that roof. Maybe you don't have to do it in the year or within the 2 years that they recommend in the study, but you might be able to push it back a year or two. So you can use that judgment. Hey, Danny, you want to go ahead and?
Yeah, it's actually a really good, as we're in the middle of budget season, what Todd provides is super helpful. Just looking at the next 4 years and assessing what is essential in terms of what needs to be, what's non-deferrable and what's deferrable. So if you have some of these projects that can be moved, like an interior painting thing, and it's recommended, the useful life that Todd provides gives an idea of when you need to perform that that function. What Todd said about phasing is really important too. You want to make sure that you're minimizing your mobility costs. But a lot of times during the season, you can look at like a 5-year plan. We offer that within our budget process at Westward, and just looking at, okay, what do we need to do for this year? We're going to defer this fence painting project, and that's going to be combined into next year. And then making sure that we're not only taking into account what our reserve transfer is from our operating budget, but seeing what supplemental increases that we need to do based off of the reserve study. And the reserve advisors section in terms of financial planning is super helpful in that aspect and taking a look at what we need to do to get to that point. So it's always imperative to talk with your unit owners and get full buy-in with like what the plan is. As Todd says, it's helpful to come with teeth and provide that these figures are not coming from nowhere. They're based on real structural needs that the association has to undertake, and very helpful just planning that out for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years and seeing where you land.
Yeah, great comments, Danny. Great comments. Very good. Thanks for jumping in. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just real quick, if I could add 2 quick notes. I just want to make sure deferring, just because you defer an expenditure doesn't mean it goes away. I had a few weeks ago, association, they decided they didn't need to do some of the expenditures that we had for 2025 in their budget. I asked where they went. They said they just deleted them because they didn't need to do them in 2025. It's like, no, that's not how that works. Like almost every reserve expenditure in your study will have to occur at some point. We could argue all day when, but it doesn't just go away if you defer it. And also a quick note on the cost of the reserve studies. The cost of reserve study is always less than 1% of the expenditures identified in that study. So yes, I get 2,500, 3,000 can be a lot to some of these communities, but there's much bigger fish to fry within that study, much bigger expenditures to take on, just to put that in a frame of reference.
All right, I have a couple more questions for you. So one is, how do you determine that so as a board, how do they determine whether or not the study is accurate? And should they consider changing companies for like updates?
Yeah, so first of all, that's a great question. We'll often get that question, like, how often do you guys get this right? And my only response to that is like, we wouldn't be hired over 3,500 times a year if we didn't get it right every once in a while. Of course, we can't get the exact expenditures in the exact years, but we would have grown into what we are and be hired that many times if we didn't get it right enough to have reasonable contributions. And again, it's the contributions that should be taken as gospel, not the expenditures. If you have a reserve state provider who their estimates over the years, as you get a reserve study done year after year that goes by, you look at what they're recommending. If they're reasonable, the timing and costs are in the ballpark, and they give you that support, they support you throughout that entire journey, throughout that entire partnership, that you don't just get the report and they go away, probably no need to switch. I'd stay with that company. If you're skeptical of the results, or you start to see a lot of expenditures that are way off in timing and costs, probably time to look to somebody else to provide that report.
Okay, and then we have another question in the chat. Since we're in the middle of budget season, how quickly can a reserve study be completed in order to help with budget planning? And then do you need to see, or I'm sorry, then the question I guess is for us more, will we see the suggested vendor cost options for the reserve study? So how long does it take you to prepare a study?
So as you could probably guess, there's quite a high demand for our studies at the moment. Contracts that we get today, we are inspecting in December, some in January. The major reserve study providers are way out there as well. So it's probably too late for 2025 budgeting. But this isn't something you want to rush. Like, we want to take your time, do justice to the inspection, do justice to developing the report, and do justice to allowing us to come back and meet with the owners and board and talk them through it. Let's talk through it. It's not we don't want to rush to give you the report and then you not have much time to digest it and figure out what you're going to do for the next budgeting season, for the budget. So even though we're way backed up, my opinion, is actually a good thing, because it gives us time before that next round of budgeting to talk it through and make sure we're all comfortable with the partnership.
And I'd jump in on that too and say that now is probably the best time to start looking at a reserve study for the 2026 budget season, so that you have time for the reserve study to fully take place, and for the board to really dig in and digest it over the time. So anyone considering, this is the perfect time to start looking at it for the 2026 budgetary season.
Yeah.
Perfect. As in, to that end, just to even touch on something that you mentioned earlier, Todd, about the partnership and what you do besides just putting the study together and handing us a tool, is that you do give a spreadsheet and you do give something. So if there is a hands-on board that is more involved and wants to look at different scenarios and have follow-up conversations, it's extremely helpful for the board so that they fully understand the impact. If they want to change the type of component, go from, a chain link fence to a composite wood fence, or different things like that, it gives them the ability to have those conversations with you and partner with you. You're not just there to provide this study and let us flounder trying to, we're the expert on how to read it and help work with them, but you're the expert that prepared it. So it is something that's going to take our clients over time in order to understand it.
Yeah. Well said. Well said.
All right. Are there any other questions? You can either raise your hand using the, hand raise, or go ahead and throw them into the chat. All right. If not, we thank you all for joining us this evening. I definitely want to thank Todd for joining us and helping, explain the importance of the reserve study, and obviously the managers that were able to dedicate some of their time to help, give out the information, how we use it, and what our experience is. I appreciate everybody's time this evening, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for doing it. It was helpful.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. And thank you to all the managers who jumped in. That was great. Very good insight.
All right.
Thanks so much,
everyone.
Todd.
Enjoy the rest of budgeting season. We'll see you guys soon.
Sounds good. Have a great evening.
All right, you too. Bye.
Bye.